Daniel Dwyer 21, April 8, 2055 AD. Hannah Dunn was on top of the world, queen in her own right. She had freed the spirit, and she delighted that he again had set out to save the world, one person at a time. She had taken him to the isolated wooded cottage she had purchased with cash under a fake name over a decade earlier, far from Las Vegas, in a rural area of the Northeast, surrounded by a much heavier population, and reports of his acts of vigilantism almost immediately started pouring in. And suddenly, the people of one of the most crime-riddled parts of the world had a reason to fear the consequences of their actions, and practically overnight, all of the northeastern states saw a dramatic plummet in crime rates. He was saving so many that he hardly did anything but sleep for the first few days, waking for only moments at a time between intervals of out-of-body experiences, as there was need for so many interventions. So many executions. Hannah even had to clean up a few of his messes when he'd put himself to sleep whilst on the way to the toilet, but she didn't mind. She'd clean any mess he made if it meant Daniel was saving a life. It justified her choice to free him to see that he was so hard at work, and she would wade through whatever river she must to see him go on, piss or otherwise. They had everything that they needed to survive in the cottage alone for 10 years, if not longer. Hannah had been ready for this to happen since before she'd laid eyes on Daniel, had set it all up before disappearing from the world. As the days passed, Daniel stayed awake for longer and longer periods of time. Hannah used the time to feed him and instruct him on where they would be sleeping, where they were to bathe, how to stay warm, how to feed himself, and use the things that he would need to know how to use if he should ever be left alone. And his eyes began to heal, and the whites of his eyes began to return, though they were forever scarred. Just as the doctor had so wisely done, she was teaching him how to survive on his own should something ever happen to her, and he, in a short time, again became the repetitive, routine, boring automaton she knew and loved. There were fruit trees in the meadows surrounding the cottage, wonderful views of nature, and an overall sense of serenity encompassed the landscape. It was breathtaking in the proper light. Altogether, it was a very nice place to die, as they would both soon discover. It had been a week since she'd rescued him and taken him to the cottage, and she was feeling good. She was starting to live out the fantasy she'd had in mind all the while after learning about Daniel's way of life, a dream she'd had in the foreground of her thoughts for the better part of the last decade. And she enjoyed Daniel as though he was her husband, talking to him as though he cared to interact with her, ordering him to do things that made him feel more real to her. They picked fruit together, took care of the cottage together, prepared their meals together, and they would sit on the porch swing and she would instruct him to put his arm around her. At the end of a nice day, she said, "Daniel, I want to bathe with you tonight. I want you to wash my body and I will wash yours." As usual, Daniel did not hesitate for one moment. The next time he looked into his 8-ball moments later, he immediately got up and left her swinging on the porch by herself, went inside and proceeded directly to the bathroom, stripped off his clothes while turning the faucet on, set his 8-ball on the counter, and entered the stand-up shower. Then he stood and waited, the water splashing off of his shoulder. Hannah slowly walked into the room, peeling her clothes off in a seductive manner, trying to appeal to Daniel as though he were any other man, but he did not look at her. He showed no interest. She didn't care, though. This was her fantasy, and she was going to live it her way. She entered the shower with him, and he started right away systematically cleaning her body, and not in a gentle or pleasing way, scrubbing her like she were a large animal being groomed, and not at all like the way she'd envisioned. Even when he cleaned her privates, he did so with absolutely no sign of him having been remotely seduced by her. It felt to Hannah almost as if she'd been put through an automatic car wash as opposed to having been rubbed down by a man, and it took her a moment to collect her bearings after being handled in such a way. "Jesus Christ," she remarked as he finished cleaning her. Then he waited for her to wash him, and she did, but she didn't treat him roughly. She kissed the places she cleaned and spent a good length of time soaping up his penis, but it did not become stiff. Even when she kissed the tip of it and pursed a bit of it between her lips, he showed no indication that he was aroused whatsoever. Never one to be discouraged, Hannah finished cleaning him and rinsed him off. Then she handed him the 8-ball, turned around, stuck her ass out, and said, "You can have sex with me if you want, Daniel." He looked into the 8-ball, but he did nothing. Hannah pressed her still perfect ass against Daniel's waist and reached down between her legs, finding his flaccid penis and rubbing it against her vagina as she gyrated against it, the lukewarm shower water running down her back. She let out a little gasp from the contact, and then she said, "Okay, Daniel, make your dick hard, put down your 8-ball, and fuck me." She didn't look back, but she could tell when he'd again looked into his 8-ball, because she felt as his penis quickly swelled, and then saw him reach over to the counter and set down his 8-ball. Then he started right in fucking her hard from behind. At first she was alarmed and again shaken from her fantasy by the hard sex, but she adapted to the rhythm quickly and was soon enjoying him to the fullest. He didn't have the 8-ball in his hand anymore, and was therefore unreceptive to commands, and it is questionable as to whether or not he could comprehend anything, much less process what she said next. As he repeatedly slammed into her from behind, having shortly adjusted to the aggressive treatment, she began to thrust her hips back and forth in time, moaned in pleasure, and said, "Yes, give me a baby, Daniel." Alexander 23, January 4th, 45,204 BC. The horizon was now a wall of ice in every direction, and their once vast paradise had shriveled into a sliver of green warmth in a valley surrounded by mountains of bitter cold. The wind constantly whirled at the borders of the canyon where the ferocious cold met the lingering warmth, and it was becoming too loud to ignore anymore. All Hemha could do was strain to keep his love from having to hear it, and so he kept it from her ears the best he could, just as he'd staved off so many discomforts of hers throughout her life and beyond. Lylin looked almost exactly the way that she did when he'd first met her, and was as youthful and exuberant as he remembered her being at the time. They sat by the fire next to the pond, and she finished off her fish dinner. It was a small fish, one of the very last fish left in the pond. There were so few remaining that Lylin could no longer help to catch one, and Hemhut had to call them from the water in order for her to eat. The very last of the Leboan munga had been smoked long ago. The comforts that remained were few. It was the end. Hemhut knew it, and though he was not fully prepared to say goodbye to his Lylin, and never would be, he was finally as ready as he would ever be to carry on with his destiny and let go of the world he'd in reality so long ago lost. As he played out the narrative of the day, he did so with an underlying sadness, a subtle indication that he had finally recognized that he was already alone. As Lylin finished eating, she remarked that it felt a little chilly, and Hemhut said, "I know, I'm sorry." "It's okay, Hemhut," she said. "The water is always warm. Come swim with me." She, almost as if sensing the end had come, waded into the water with her dress still on, seemingly lost in thought. Hemhut followed her in, and as she stared off into nowhere, he grabbed her from behind and lifted her up, placing her on his shoulder, and she laughed and kicked him and said, "What are you doing? It's cold up here." Then she stood and dove off of his shoulder into the pond and came up laughing, spitting out a mouthful of water. He looked lovingly and longingly at her, wishing that he could just stay, but knowing that he couldn't. "What's wrong?" she said. "Are you all right?" "I was just thinking. Do you remember when I taught you about the theories of relativity, the nature of light and space and time?" He walked toward her, cutting through the water. "Yes, what about it?" She swam further out and waded into the deeper water. "There is an aspect of the associated phenomenon that I failed to illuminate, the phenomenon known as length contraction," he said. "That's what you were thinking about?" she asked, her concern fading away. "You had me worried there for a minute." "Well, I was looking through time, taking another long look into the future, and it occurred to me that I never shared this with you. But without knowledge of length contraction, the distorted images that I see would never make sense. To look extremely deep into the future is to see everything shrunken along the axis of its motion as if it were moving at relativistic speeds. It is only in being able to decipher that which it shows me, by applying what I know about the universe to that which I am observing, that it can be understood. For as I look in various directions in time, I do so either with great energy or from great distances. It takes an understanding of what I am seeing to decipher it. It comes naturally to me as it was the way I perceived everything from after the birth of the universe and on, if not before. But it occurred to me that you may want to know what causes this phenomenon. Well, Hemhut, it was so long ago that we talked about it, you'd have to refresh me on... She dwelled in thought for a moment, and then looked at Hemhut with a dumbfounded expression. Then she said, Hemhut, how long has it been since you first taught me about relativity? I don't know, a couple of 100 years, I guess, he said, and a model of a semi-transparent box appeared in the sky above them, and he said, Now, watch. There is a light in the center of the cube, and sensors to receive the light embedded. She interrupted him, looked him dead in the eye, grabbed his arms, and said, Hemhut, how can it have been a few 100 years since you told me about relativity? Tawalans don't live that long. In fact, you said that I had about 100 years left to live at around that same time. What's going on, Hemhut? Wait. And the faint memory of her death came to her mind. That day that he'd carried her. That day she'd awoke unable to walk. And she began to cry and said, Wait. Hemhut scooped her up and gently hugged her as her mind raced. And he tried to console her, and he said, I'm sorry, my love. She angrily removed herself from his arms and splashed into the water, then swam directly to the shore, choking on the water she'd unexpectedly swallowed. Hemhut followed her and again apologized. Lylin, I'm sorry. Hemhut, you didn't let me have my death? She turned, spitting out the last of her coughs. What is wrong with you? You've just been keeping me here? How long has it been, Hemhut? Not long, like 500 years, he said, kneeling down, still half in the water, to bring his eye level below hers. 500 years? She yelled, then threw her hands on top of her shaking head and muttered, What? How? No. Why? Why, Hemhut? He started, but she again cut him off. Hemhut, we talked about this. You were supposed to let me go. Why am I still here? He again went to respond, but before he could speak, she said, You know what? No, I don't want to hear your voice right now. I need to think. She walked up the beach and shivered a bit before she sat by the fire to warm herself. Hemhut stayed where he was for a while, and after a few minutes went to go and talk to her. But as soon as he sat down, she stood up and walked away. You're cold, he said. Come back by the fire. Why don't you just make me do it? You control me, right? She said. I can't believe that you did this to me. Did to me what you did to fate. I'm not even real. You are real to me, he said. Lylin stormed back over to him and promptly slapped him across the face. Then she broke down crying and curled up in his lap and shivered and cried, taking in the warmth from both the giant and the fire. What happened to the plan, Hemhut? She said. I thought that you said you had found a way to die and that you were going to follow me into the afterlife. Why are you still here? I must wait for my death, he said. There is still much to be done in preparation for it, and I don't want to go through it without you. I don't want to be anywhere or do anything without you. So, when I leave here and go to my home world to follow my fate, I intend to erase my own memory, give away my gifts of sight to the humans, and keep only my love for you. Only I will not remember you as you are. I will only know your name, and that I am meant to love you. Then I can pass the years until my death without having to remember that I have lost you, without living in constant anguish without you, and instead live out my days forever in pursuit of my vision of you without the weight of forever mourning your loss. I kept you here so that I could know something of the real you a while longer, experience my one true love a while more before I shed my memory of you and wait for death. At what cost? Do you think that this is healthy for you to do this, Hemhut? She sat up and put her hand over her heart and placed her other hand on his chest and said, Do you think that this is what I would have wanted for you? How much of the real me can you even distinguish from this empty version of me? I have more memories of us together from after I was dead than I have from when I was alive. In fact, I can hardly remember anything from back then. Most of what I remember was never even real. I remember every moment of your life, my love, he said. And just as your memories made you so much of who you were then, they make you who you are now. You are still you, the absolute best you that I could recreate. I am not going to ask for your forgiveness, but I am going to ask for your understanding. I'm done with you for now. She hopped off of him, still shivering, and stood very near the fire. I need to figure this out. Go. She looked around and then pointed at the pond and said, Go wait in the bottom of the pond until I tell you to come up. I don't want to look at you right now. Go. He huffed and he got up and did as she said, and walked where his love had bid him walk, and waited at the bottom of the pond as she again began to break down crying. After a while she got a hold of herself, then she called for Fate, and he kept her company by the fire for a time, the fire that never seemed to get any smaller. As she gently scratched him, she said, Well, Fate, I guess we're two of a kind, two of the same mind. I never thought that he would let me end up like this. I don't even know what I am now. Fate made a little yowl, almost as if he understood her, and was replying to her in Babbitt language, and he adorably turned his head to look at her sideways. No, she said. Then she stood up with Fate in her hands and started to make the cold walk back to the palace. No, let's let him stay down there for a while. She went back to the palace and went to sleep, and for the first time slept with the little Babbitt cat on her bed with her like she'd always wanted to, the little fluff ball curled up at the foot of the bed. She awoke the next morning to find that Fate had gone in the night, and she stretched and rolled out of bed, and let the true knowledge of her being wash over her anew. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't feel hungry. She walked down to the edge of the pond and sat, looking down to where she could just barely distinguish what she thought was Hemhut at the bottom. She sat, and she thought, and she let him drown a while longer. Then, having finally taken a look at herself, she sighed and said, All right, you can come up. He slowly ascended, walking along the bottom of the pond until reaching the shore and breaching the water. He did not gasp for breath. He did not need to breathe. He was perfectly fine. He looked down at her as he passed her by, and facetiously he said, Do you feel better now? Shut up and listen to me, she said. I understand why you did it, okay? I remember how I felt when I thought that the amalgamator had killed you, how it felt when I believed that you were dead, and I would have done the same thing if I had the power that you have. I would never, ever have let you go. I love you and I do forgive you, but this has to end, my love. I know, he said. You will come and find me when you die, won't you? A single tear fell from her eye as she embraced his waist. I will. If there is a way, I swear I will, he said. She sniffled and started to climb him and said, Then let us have one last day together, one last wonderful day, and then you let me go, okay? She climbed up and kissed his cheek and whispered in his ear, Let me go, okay? Hemhut could not cry. His entire supply of tears had been drawn from him the day that his true love had died in his arms all those centuries ago, but he felt like crying, and he squeezed her tight as he agreed and said, I will, and I will find you, I promise. After a little more venting her emotions, Lylin pushed away from their embrace and said, Let's make it a wonderful day, the best day ever. He didn't have the chance to make her a wreath in the night, as he'd been at the bottom of the pond throughout its passing, so the first place that they went was the flower field, and while he made her a green and yellow flower wreath, two of her favorite colors by far, she clumsily made him one as well of the same colors. It was her first attempt, and it was a shoddy, flimsy, uneven halo when she was done. He said that he loved it, though. When she went to fit it on his head, she realized that it was entirely too small and looked so silly on top of his huge skull that she burst out laughing when she stood back and looked at him. They spent the day laughing and talking and loving each other. It was just the type of day that he wanted for his forever, the type of day one only experiences with their soulmate, only when with the one they truly and deeply love. At the end of the day, after the sun had long set and the second sun shone all the more bright, while they swam in the still lukewarm pond, she decided to confront the situation. She yawned and said, "I am tired. Are you ready, my love? Let us have one more dance, hear one more song, and then you let me go to sleep forever and have my death, and then you come and find me, okay?" She did not seem afraid at all, even though Hemhut could sense the crushing anxiety from deep within her. She was facing her fear of death and trying to be strong for him, to show him that she was unafraid. For she was more afraid that she would let her fear control her and back out and ask Hemhut to keep her, to let her go on living in this death as he'd so kept her all the centuries past. The reason that she decided to have one last dance, hear one last song, was because it marked a countdown. It punctuated the moment. She needed a countdown because she was teetering. She knew that Hemhut would gladly wait another day and then another and so on if she asked him to. And if she didn't just jump, didn't just accept her death, she would forever remain on the ledge, forever fearful of the inevitable. "Yes, my love, as you wish. What would you like to hear?" he asked. "You pick something," she said. "An earth song. I like most of them." "Very well, my love," he said. "Watch the sky. You are going to love this." The song of his selection began playing, and as it did, the night sky burst into a barrage of colors, the clouds each taking on different hues, and he made bursts of fiery colors like fireworks erupt from the sky in time with the pronounced drum beats of the song where he deemed would delight her, and delight her it did. She exclaimed with a loud "Wow!" as she marveled at the spectacle, and they slow danced in the water, her huge smile and her bright eyes bringing a glow to her face, sparkling in the shower of colors. There was a moment when Lylan thought the song was going to end, and she felt afraid and drew close and embraced him. But then the song went on, and she let out a little nervous giggle, and she squeezed Hemhut. Then she whispered into his ear, "I love you so much. I can't wait to actually see you again." Then she pulled away and kissed him, her final tears falling from her eyes, a result of so many emotions at once, and he said, "I love you more than anything. You are everything to me, and I can't wait to find you." Lylan laughed and wiped her tears away, and they swayed together in the water until the song was over and the music faded away. Then he picked her up and held her in the cradle of his arms, just as he had on the day that she died so long ago. "What do I do now?" she asked him, her breath shaky from her rapidly beating heart. "You just let me know when you're ready. Close your eyes, and I will send you to sleep," he said, looking down at her with a comforting smile, finally ready to release her. "Oh, okay," she said. Then she closed her eyes and lay back, then suddenly snapped her eyes open again and sat up and reached for Hemhut's hand and said, "Hemhut, I'm scared." "No, you're not, my love. I am. You are the most fearless person I have ever met. You have never been afraid of anything in your life. It is I who is afraid, not you," he said, nodding at her with a cracking, sad smile. "Oh." She lay back down, somehow not very comforted by his words, and said, "I love you, Hemhut." "I love you, Lylan," he said. "Then I guess it's time." She nodded to him as she laid her hands across her chest. "I'll be waiting for you." Then she closed her eyes, and as she succumbed to her long overdue death, she heard his final words to her. "Until next we meet, farewell, my love." Her body fell limp in his arms once more, and one of her arms fell lifeless from the cradle of his hold, dangling freely as her body shriveled up, revealing the true state of her being. Then, as the frost began to spread across the ground under Hemhut's feet, he lifted off, never to set foot on Tawala again, and the giant carried the lifeless corpse of his true love with him as he traversed space on his way to Earth. She was gone. He would never again look into her eyes, never again revel in her kindness or bask in the warmth of her love, never argue again with her or hear her laugh while he lived. He was alone, alone and more than ready to die.